Betrayed and left to rot in a fiery canyon, Lila Carver battles to survive, but who's closing in now and what hidden danger waits in the dark? You won't predict the end. Lila Carver jolted awake to a heat so savage it clawed into her skin like a living thing, scorching her deep as if it wanted to burn its mark straight into her soul and leave it there forever. It struck her before anything else, before the pain that would come, before the thirst that already scratched at her throat, before she could even begin to piece together where she was or how she'd ended up in this mess. Her lips were cracked and splitting dry as old parchment. Her head pounded like someone was smashing a hammer against her skull, and her back pressed hard against something solid, hot and unyielding, searing her through her torn clothes. She forced her eyes open, slow and heavy, the effort making her W above her stretched to sky so blue it hurt, bright and piercing like a blade of light cutting into her. Clouds drifted high overhead, pale and thin, moving like restless ghosts with no care for the broken woman sprawled below them. Around her, towering cliffs of red sandstone rose into the air, sharp and jagged, their edges cutting the horizon like a crown of thorns, boxing her into this dusty, lonely trap. The air tasted dry and rough, thick with sand that stuck to her tongue, mixed with a faint sour tang of blood that twisted her stomach and sharpened her fear. She tried to sit up. Her body wouldn't listen. Pain crashed over her like a storm, breaking sharp and slicing through her shoulder like a knife, heavy and throbbing in her ribs as if they'd been crushed, roaring loudest in her ankle like a wild beast gnawing at bones. Her wrists were bound tight with coarse rope, the kind that scratched and dug in her skin, leaving it raw red and stinging. Her hands tingled, going numb from the pressure, her fingers useless, curling weakly at her sides. Her dress hung torn along one side, the fabric ripped and ragged, soaked dark with sweat and something thicker, blood. She realized, her breath catching in her chest, shallow and quick. She blinked hard, fighting the fog in her mind, and turned her head, sand grinding against her cheek. Flies buzzed close, darting in lazy circles around a deep, ugly gash on her thigh, the sound drilling into her ears. This was a nightmare she could wake from, no fever dream to shake off, and it hit her memory, rushing back like a cold, hard slap across her face. Silas Cahn's voice, low and steady, smooth as oil, but fake as a crooked gambler's grin. It's better this way, darling, he'd said, his hand brushing her cheek, soft and warm, a lover's touch, right before he shoved her off the edge into the abyss below. She remembered the fall, the blur of rocks and sky spinning around her, tumbling over each other in a chaos of red and blue, the crack of a gunshot ringing sharp in her ears, loud enough to make her flinch. Even now, then nothing but silence, heavy and final. Silas Cahn, the man she married, the men she trusted, had left her here to die in this canyon alone, broken and bleeding. LLA tried to swallow, but her throat was a dry, cracked wasteland, too parched for even a single tear to slip free. Her eyes burning with the effort, high above, buzzards circled in slow, lazy loops, their black wings slicing through the sky, not diving yet, but watching with cold, patient eyes, waiting for her to stop moving. They knew death was near, they always did, hovering like shadows ready to claim her. She lay there for what felt like hours, maybe more, letting the sun hammer down on her like a punishment she hadn't earned, its heat pressing in her chest, her arms, her legs relentless and cruel. Her mind drifted, pulling up pieces of her past like smoke curling from a dying fire. Faint and fleeting, she saw Eli Dawson's warm, gentle eyes, the kind that crinkled at the corners when he smiled at her over breakfast, his voice soft as he hummed an old tune. She smelled the rich, earthy scent of coffee brewing at dawn, the steam rising from the pot in their little kitchen. She felt the softness of A.W. Shaw he draped over her shoulders on cold nights, his hands lingering as he tucked it around her, all of it gone, stolen by a fever that swept through their home 2 winters back, tearing him away and leaving her empty, hollowed out, alone. Now she had this, a shattered body sprawled in the dirt, a soul aching in the stillness, and a husband who turned out to be a monster wearing a man's face. But LLA Carver wasn't the kind of woman to lie down and give up, not quietly, not ever, no matter how much it hurt. With a groan that scraped her throat raw, she rolled on her side, her shoulder screaming at the movement, sand dug in her cheek, rough and hot, sticking her sweat-soaked skin gritty against her jaw. The canyon floor burned beneath her like a skillet left too long over a roaring fire, searing her palms as she pressed them into it, trying to push herself up. She tugged at the rope around her wrists, nothing moved, no slack, no give, just the bite of it cutting deeper. Her hands were losing feeling, her fingers clumsy and numb, tingling with pins and needles. Her breath came short and shallow, rasping in her chest like a broken bellows, each inhale tasting of dust and despair. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote out, a sharp, lonely yip, its call bouncing off the cliffs and fading into the vastness. Unanswered. You bastard, she whispered, her voice hoarse and brittle, barely audible even to herself. You sorry, lying bastard. Silas Cahn had swept into her life 6 months ago, all charm and golden promises, his words sweet enough to melt her deaf fences, his grin bright enough to blind her to the truth. She should have seen through it, should have trusted the twist in her gut when he wouldn't hold her gaze for long, when his smile stayed tight and never reached his eyes, when his laugh sounded hollow. If she listened close, she'd been lonely, worn thin by the townsfolk's stares, their whispers behind her back as she passed, the quiet judgment in their polite hellos and quick nods. He'd offer her a way out, a new start, a hand to hold, or so she thought. Turns out he was a trap, a snare dressed up as salvation, and she'd walked right into it, blind and hopeful. She clenched her teeth hard, her jaw aching from the strain, and kicked her good leg forward, dragging herself inch by painful inch toward the shadow of a boulder just ahead, its dark shape a faint promise of relief. The sun crawled across the sky, slow and cruel, but its heat burned fast, relentless, blistering her skin with every move, turning her arms and neck red and raw. Every shift of her body felt like Crawling a mile through broken glass, her torn dress catching on rocks, snagging and ripping more, her bad leg dragging uselessly behind her like a dead weight. The canyon stayed eerily still, mocking her struggle. No water trickled nearby, no shade stretched out to cool her, no sign of help anywhere, just her against the endless empty nothing stretching out in every direction. Her heart pounded a stubborn beat that refused to quit, thumping loud in her ears, driving her on. Then through the haze of pain and heat she spotted something, a shard of black stone, sharp and glinting like a blade, half buried in the sand a few feet away, catching the sunlight and flashes obsidian. Her breath caught a flicker of hope sparking inside her, small but fierce. She clawed to the dust, fingers stretching, straining, brushing the edge of it, slipping once, twice. Come on, she thought, gritting her teeth so hard her head throbbed, her vision swimming. Just a little more, please. Finally she hooked it with 2 fingers, trembling with effort, her nails scraping the sand, and dragged it toward her chest. It was hot, her skin like a coal plucked from a fire, but she gripped it tight, refusing to let go, her hands shaking but determined, twisting her body awkwardly, her ribs protesting with every move. She started sawing at the rope on her wrists, each scrape of the stone sent a jolt of pain racing up her arm like a knife, twisting deep in her muscles, sharp and hot, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop, not now. Sweat trickled into her eyes stinging and blurring her vision, mixing with the dust caked on her face, running in gritty streaks down her cheeks. Her breath hitched, coming in ragged, uneven gasps that shook her chest, her lungs burning. A sound broke through the silence, a faint clatter, a rock shifting somewhere close, rolling down the slope. She froze hard, slamming against her ribs loud and fast. Was someone there? Silas C. back to finish her his men checking the canyon. She held her breath, ears straining, eyes darting to the cliffs above, searching the shadows for movement. Nothing moved, no shapes, no sounds, just the wind maybe playing tricks on afraid nerves. She shook her head, shoving the fear down deep, and cut faster, desperation driving her hands, her fingers slipping on the stone's smooth edge of the rope, frayed strands splitting apart one by one, unraveling slow, then fast, then snap. It broke, her arms fell free, limp and aching, blood rushing back in her hands with a painful tingle that made her gasp. She nearly sobbed right there, a dry choking sound caught in her throat, but her eyes stayed dry, no tears left to give, just dust and grit. Sitting up slow, she cradled her injured leg, wincing as she shifted the pain flaring. Fresh blood had dried and dark crusty streaks down her shin, flaking off where it met the sand, the gash raw and ugly beneath. She took the obsidian and hacked at the bindings on her ankles, her movements clumsy but fierce, the stone slipping once and nicking her skin, a thin line of fresh blood welling up. She cursed Silas Kane under her breath with every slice, cursing his lies, his fake love, his coward's heart. Every word he'd ever said to her spilling out in a hiss litany of hate. The rope gave way at last, snapping free, and she kicked it off, shaking it loose, free from its bite. For the first time since she had woken, a gust of wind swept through the canyon, stirring the dust across the ground, whispering over the rocks like it was alive, watching her, urging her on, or warning her. She pushed herself up to stand, her right ankle buckled, instantly weak and swollen, sending her crashing back down her knees with a thud that jarred her whole body. She bit down hard on a scream, tasting blood where her teeth sank in her lip, her hands clawing at the sand. Standing wasn't going to happen, not yet, not with her leg twisted and useless. She'd have to crawl, drag herself through this hell if she wanted to live, if she wanted to see Silas C. pay by sunset. She'd made it 20 yards, 20 hard won, yards of burning sand and jagged stone, each one to fight against her own body. Every muscle trembled, weak and worn, her skin blistered red and raw under the sun's endless punishment, peeling in patches where it had burned worst. Her tongue felt like a dry strip of leather in her mouth, swollen and rough, sticking to her teeth, but she kept going, clawing forward one painful inch at a time, her good leg pushing against the ground, her bad one trailing, dragging a line in the dust behind her. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, something hotter, darker burned inside her now, a fire that wouldn't die. Vengeance. Silas Can's smirk flashed in her mind over and over like a needle stuck on a scratched record, taunting her, laughing at her pain. She'd find him, she'd kill him with her own hands, drive this obsidian shard into his chest, or she'd haunt him until the buzzards picked his bones clean and the wind carried his name away to nothing. When she finally slumped against the canyon wall, exhausted and shaking, darkness was creeping and pooling at the edges of the sky like spilled ink, slow and thick. Stars peeked through, faint and cold, watching her from above, distant witnesses. The wind turned sharp, slicing across her sunburned skin like a knife across raw flesh, chilling the sweat that clung to her. Is that all you've got, world? She whispered, her voice swallowed by the vastness, barely a rasp against the silence. She tried again, louder, desperate, throwing her words into the void. Help, someone out there, please, anyone. Her voice cracked, breaking into a sob that echoed off the stone walls, bouncing back to her, sounding small, lost and pitiful. Please. Swallowed by the canyon's indifference, she coughed, chest heaving, sand grating in her throat, and sat up straighter, her back pressing into the rock. Then she screamed, not a soft call, not a polite plea, but a raw, furious roar that ripped from her gut, wild and untamed, shaking her whole body, a scream that shouted to the canyon, the stars, the gods themselves, that Lilac Carver wasn't done, wasn't ready to die, wasn't giving up no matter how much it hurt. She screamed until her throat burned like she'd swallowed fire, until her voice splintered into nothing, until silence swallowed her again, heavy and Complete pressing down on her exhausted, she slumped back against the rock, waiting, listening, her ears straining for any sound. Long minutes dragged by, 5, 10, 15 more, each one stretching out like a lifetime. Nothing stirred, no answer came, just the faint rustle of the wind and her own ragged breathing. She closed her eyes, letting sleep tug at her dark and deep, pulling her under like a tide. She couldn't fight, her body surrendering at last. Then footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching over the sand and stone steady as a heartbeat cutting through the quiet. Her eyes snapped open wide and wild, adrenaline flooding her veins, jolting her awake. She tried to sit up, to move. Her body was too slow, too weak, her arms trembling as she pushed against the ground. Panic surged, clawing at her chest, tightening her throat, her pulse racing. A figure appeared at the canyon edge, tall and lean, silhouetted against the last sliver of fading sunlight, a dark shape against the orange glow, impossible to read. He descended, slowly, moving with a predator's grace, every step sure and quiet, like he belonged to this wild place, like he owned it. He wore buckskin, weathered and worn, patched at the knees, a long rifle slung across his back, the barrel catching the light. His black hair was tied back tight, swinging slightly as he moved, and a flash of turquoise gleamed at his wrist, a bright spot in the dusk. He stopped a few feet from her, staring down, his shadow falling over her. Lila's breath caught, her throat trapped there, her chest tight. He crouched, his eyes sharp and unreadable, piercing through the growing dark like they could see straight into her, through her. "You cry like a warrior," he said, his voice deep and steady, the words curling like smoke from fire, carrying an accent she couldn't place, rough and smooth at once. "Oh, are you real?" she stammered, her voice weak, trembling barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, didn't even blink, his gaze steady on her. Instead, he knelt beside her, pulled a leather canteen from his side, the leather creaking faintly, and tipped it to her lips. The water was lukewarm, stale from the heat, but it tasted like heaven, sliding down her parched throat, soothing the burn that had settled there. She drank greedily, gulping until she coughed, choking a little as it hit her dry chest, spilling a drop down her chin. "Easy," he murmured, pulling the canteen back, his tone calm but firm, a quiet command. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, gritty with sand, leaving a smear, and stared at him, trying to make sense of him, this stranger who'd appeared from nowhere. "Who are you?" she asked again, stronger now, her voice finding its edge. He paused, considering her for a long moment, like he was weighing her worth, deciding what she deserved to know. "Talone Gray," he said finally, the name short and solid. "LLA," she replied, breathless, her heart still racing, pounding against her ribs. "LLA Carver." He nodded once, a small tilt, his head then reached into a small pouch at his belt, worn and stained. He pulled out a handful of crushed herbs, dry and green, mixed them with a splash of water from the canteen, his fingers quick and and pressed the paste on her leg wound with careful hands. It stung like fire, sharp and hot, spreading through her skin. She flinched, hissing through her teeth, her body jerking against the pain. "Sorry," he said, his voice low, but his hands never wavered, steady and precise as he worked, smoothing the herbs over the gash. "You a doctor?" she asked, wincing as he pressed harder, the sting biting deeper. "No," he said, flat and simple. "What then?" She pressed, her eyes narrowing. "Men who heard scream," he answered, meeting her gaze for a moment, then looking back to his task. She studied him as he worked, his skin bronze from years under the sun, his face calm and closed off, not young, not old, timeless somehow, like the cliffs around them. A thin scar curved beneath one eye, faint, but they're catching the faint light as he moved, the story etched into his flesh. "You were silence like armor, saying little, moving with purpose, giving nothing away unless he chose to." He tied a strip of cloth around her leg, tight but gentle, knotting it with a practiced hand, his fingers brushing her skin briefly, then sat back on his heels. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low, cutting through the quiet like a blade. She hesitated, the words sticking in her throat, bitter as bile, hard to say out loud. "My husband," she said at last, forcing them out, her voice shaking with the weight of it. It didn't flinch, didn't blink, his face still as stone, unreadable. "He left me here," she added, her hands clenching in a fists at her sides. "Chop me, thought I'd stay down." Talone Gray looked up at the stars, his expression blank, like he was listening to something she couldn't hear, something far off. "He was wrong," he said simply, his voice steady, certain. Tears welled in her eyes, then finally spilling over, hot and stinging against her sunburned cheeks, carving clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking, cracking apart. "Why would someone, why would he?" She couldn't finish the question, choking her, tangling in her throat. Talone Gray stood, his shadow falling over her, tall and solid, a wall between her and the night. "Weak men fear strong women," he said, his words heavy, final, like a judgment piece. She stared up at him as he turned, scanning the ridge above, his hand resting lightly on the rifle at his back, fingers brushing the stock. Was he here to help her, or was he something else, something she couldn't trust, a new danger in a different shape? Her heart twisted, a tangle of grief for what Silas Kane had done, rage at his betrayal, and a flicker of relief she couldn't name, blooming, fragile and small in her chest, growing despite her doubt. He glanced back at her, his eyes catching hers in the dim light. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "I don't know," she said, honest, her voice small and sure. "We try," he replied, stepping closer, his tone leaving no room for argument. He held her to her feet, his arms solid as oak under her weight, steadying her as she swayed, her legs shaky, threatening to give out beneath her. She leaned on him heavily, her fingers gripping his sleeve, her nails digging in as she fought to stay upright. A horse stood nearby, dark, silent, patient, its coat blending into the shadows, its breath puffing softly in the cool air. Talone Gray lifted her into the saddle with surprising gentleness, his hands strong but careful, lifting her like she weighed nothing. Her ankle twisted as he set her down, and she bit back, a scream, gripping the leather tight, her knuckles white, pain Shooting up her leg like a bolt, he climbed up behind her, his arms circling her waist, not close, not hesitant, just there, holding her steady, a quiet strength she could feel through his grip. He clicked his tongue softly, a low sound, and guided the horse deeper into the canyon shadows, the walls closing in around them, red and looming. LLA leaned back against him, exhaustion stealing her thoughts one by one, dragging her down into a heavy fog, but one stayed sharp, cutting through the haze. She would live. She would heal, and Silas Kane would pay for every second of this, every drop of her blood staining the sand, every lie he fed her. She makes sure of it. The canyon narrowed as they rode, red walls towering high on both sides, lit only by a thin strip of moonlight slicing through the dark above, casting faint silver streaks across the ground. Talon Gray's arms held her firm, his body warm against her back, a quiet anchor in the swaying motion of the horse, his chest rising and falling steady behind her. Her bones ached, her skin throbbed in places she didn't know could hurt, raw and tender, but he rode carefully, keeping the horse steady, avoiding jolts, his hands light on the reins. Who is this man, this stranger who'd come out of nowhere, stepping into her nightmare? Where was he taking her? To safety, to shelter, or to something worse? Some new trap she couldn't see. She wanted to ask, to demand answers, to know what he wanted from her, but her voice wouldn't come, lost somewhere in her dry throat, buried under layers of pain and fatigue. The trail widened after a while, the walls pulling back, then split behind a tumble of rocks and boulders, a hidden path she'd never have seen, shadowed in secret. He guided the horse through without a word, without hesitation, the animal stepping sure-footed over the uneven ground, like he knew every crack and curve of this land by heart, like it was carved into his bones, a map he'd walked 1,000 times. They emerged into a hidden cove tucked between sandstone arches that curved overhead like a cathedral of stone, ancient and weathered. The wind softened here, barely a whisper brushing against her face, and the stars thickened in the sky, bright and countless. A blanket of light above the air carried a faint scent of sage and cooling earth, a relief after the dust and blood that had choked her all day. Sharp and clean in her lungs, a small fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by old bones from past meals, cracked and scattered, scorch marks staining the ground. Dark Tone Gray dismounted first, his boots silent on the sand, barely a sound as he landed, then reached up to ease her down. Her foot hit the ground, pain shot through her leg like lightning, ripping a gas from her throat, loud and sharp, echoing faintly off the arches. She collapsed against him, her breath hissing through clenched teeth, her hands clutching his arm, fingers digging into the buck skin. Without a word he scooped her up in both arms, strong and steady, and carried her to a bedroll set beneath a shallow rock shelf, his steps even unshaken by her weight. The stone above was blackened from old fires, smoothed by time and smoke curving over them. A blanket lay folded neatly beside it, the end of a bough propped against the wall nearby. It would worn but strong, the string toe. This wasn't just a campsite, it was a home, or as close as a man like him might get to one, a place carved out of the wild, hidden from the world. Lila tried to speak, to ask where they were, what this place was, but the ache in her ribs stole her breath, leaving her silent, her chest tight. He set her down gently on the bedroom, the fabric rough against her skin, then knelt beside her, unwrapping the claw from her leg with careful fingers, peeling it back slow. The wound was angry, swollen red around the edges, pulsing with heat, but no fresh blood seeped out, just the old crusted streaks dark against her pale shin. You didn't scream this time, he said quietly, his voice low in the stillness, almost lost in the crackle of the wind outside. I'm too tired, she muttered, her throat rough as sandpaper, her words slurring a little. He nodded once, like he approved of her grit, like it meant something to him, then stood and moved to the fire pit, his shadow stretching long behind him. She watched him through half-closed eyes, her vision blurry at the edges as he gathered twigs and dry grass from a crevice in the rock nearby, his hands quick and sure, stacking them into a small neat pyramid in the pit. With a flint and steel he sparked a flame, quick and practiced, striking it once, twice, until it caught, and soon the fire crackled to life, casting long flickering shadows across the stone walls around them, dancing over the arches. He poured water from his canteen into a battered tin pot, the metal dented and scratched, added a pinch of green herbs from his pouch and set it over the flames, the water hissing as it heated, the scent drifted over as it bubbled, bitter, clean, sharp like mint mixed with smoke, cutting through the stale air, waking her senses a little. He came back to her, kneeling again, cradling her head with one hand, his palm rough but steady against her neck, and held the pot to her lips. What's this, she asked, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper, suspicion flickering in her chest. For pain and sleep, he said simply, his eyes on hers calm and unblinking. I don't trust you yet, she admitted, eyeing him, her hand twitching toward the obsidian in her pocket. You don't have to, he replied, unfazed, his voice even, but you'll need your strength. She hesitated, her gaze locked with his, searching for a lie, a threat, finding nothing but that steady calm. She drank it, tasted awful, like dirt and ash mixed together, bitter on her tongue, but warmth bloomed in her chest, spreading slow and steady, chasing the cold from her bones, easing the ache just a little. She sank back into the bedroll, her body heavy, sinking into the ground, and he adjusted the blanket over her shoulders, tucking it around her with a care she hadn't expected. You going to stay there all night, she asked, half joking, her voice slurring as the herbs took hold, pulling her towards sleep. I don't sleep easy when people bleed near me, he said, settling across from her, legs crossed, rifle resting beside him like an old friend, close enough to grab. She smirked despite herself, a faint twitch of her lips, the first real lightness she'd felt in days. Ain't that poetic, she murmured, her eyes drifting shut for a moment, then opening again. He didn't answer, didn't smile, just sat there, the firelight dancing in his eyes, throwing strange shifting patterns across his scarred face, highlighting the lines of that scar under his eye. For a long while neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out comfortable in its way. The wind whispered through the rocks outside the cove, soft and restless, brushing against the arches, and somewhere high above an owl hooted once. It's called sharp and fleeting, swallowed by the night. Guess I owe you then, thanks, she said, finally breaking the quiet, her voice stronger now, pushing through the fog. You don't, he said, his tone flat, brushing it off. Well, I'm saying it anyway, she insisted, stubborn. He inclined his head slightly, barely a nod, accepting it without fuss, like it didn't matter. Either way, what kind of man rides toward a scream in the canyon, she asked, curiosity tugging at her now, her mind waking up despite the horror. One who's heard it before, he said, his voice low, weighted with something old and heavy, a shadow crossing his face. You lost someone, she pressed, sensing the story behind his words, the pain he carried. His eyes shifted to the fire, staring into the flames like they held answers or memories he didn't want to see. My brother, he said after a long pause, the words slow, deliberate. 10 years ago, cavalry patrol took him, said he was stealing horses. He wasn't. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, a lump forming there hard to push down. What happened, she asked, softer now, almost afraid of the answer. They sent him back in pieces, he said, his jaw clenching, the fire light catching the tension in his face, the scar under his eye standing out sharper, a mark of that loss. Wind cried for days after, loud enough to wake the dead. Maybe he screamed too, she whispered almost to herself, picturing it, a man alone calling out unanswered. Maybe he did, he said, meeting her gaze for a moment, his eyes dark and deep, then looking away back to the fire. Silence settled between them, thick and heavy like dust falling after a storm, blanketing the cove. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, the wool lace scratching her skin, grounding her. Why live out here, she asked, her voice steady now, curious. No town, no roof, no people. People kill each other over things that don't matter, he said, his voice steady, certain, like a truth he'd learned the hard way. Out here it's just truth, she nodded, slowly rolling the words around at her mind, tasting them, liking the weight of them. I think I could live with that, she said, half serious. Yes, you wouldn't, he replied, blunt, cutting through a thought. Not for long, he stood, then moving to the edge of the cove, scanning the trail behind them with a slow, careful sweep of his eyes, his posture tense but controlled. Moonlight glinted off his rifle barrel, cold and silver, a warning in the dark, a promise of what he could do. You expecting someone, she called, a chill creeping up her spine, settling in her bones like ice. Smoke earlier, he said, not turning, his voice low, clipped. Northridge, not mine. Her blood turned to ice, her heart skipping a beat, then racing. Silas Kane coming back to make sure she was dead. She could picture him now, riding with his men, checking the canyon for a body, his smirk twisting into a snarl when he found her gone, his temper flaring. How many were with him? How close were they already? Then we won't be here when he does, Talone, Grace said, turning back to her, his voice calm but edged with steel, his eyes meeting hers, steady and sure. She nodded, her pulse hammering in her ears, questions piling up. How much time did they have? What was Silas C planning? Could they outrun him by morning? Her leg throbbed less, the swelling eased a little under the cloth. He tied the herbs, doing their work. Talone Gray handed her a strip of jerky and a hunk of dry bread, tough to chew, salty and stale, but she forced it down, her stomach growling for more, grateful for anything. She tried standing, leaning on him for support, her bad leg shaky but holding her weight better than before. A small victory. You walk like a drunk mule, he said, deadpan, watching her wobble, one hand steadying her elbow. She chuckled, the sound surprising her, rough but real, breaking through the tension. You talk like one, she shot back, and he raised an eyebrow, almost amused, a flicker of something warm in his eyes. He led her to a rock ledge overlooking the canyon's bend, a high perch with the world stretched out below them, flatlands rolling into distant mountains, the horizon hay and endless, shimmering in the heat. Far off, a faint plume of smoke curled into the sky, thin but steady, rising from somewhere beyond the ridges. Too far for a campfire, she said, squinting against the glare, shielding her eyes with her hand. Unless it's a big camp, he replied, his tone even, but his eyes narrowed as he watched it, calculating. Her stomach twisted, a knot of dread tightening. Cold and heavy, was it Silas Kane's men sitting up waiting? Someone else, some new threat? You ever kill a man, she asked, her voice low, testing him, needing to know. Yes, he said, no hesitation, no doubt. Would you again if he needed killing? He said, his voice hard now, certain. Silas came to us, she said, her voice harder still, her hands clenching at her sides, nails digging into her palms. He studied her, his gaze piercing, weighing her words, her resolve. Revenge costs more than it gives, he warned, his tone low, a caution. I'm not after revenge, she said, meeting his eyes unflinching. I'm after justice. They looked the same in the dark, he said, and she couldn't argue with that, the truth of it settling heavy between them that evening as the sun dipped low, painting the cliffs red and gold, casting long shadows across the sand. He showed her how to hold a knife right. She gripped it wrong at first, her fingers clumsy, the blade awkward and heavy in her hand, slipping in her sweaty palm. He adjusted her grip without a word, his touch firm but not rough, guiding her fingers until it felt steady, balanced. Why teach me this, she asked, turning the knife in the fading light, testing its weight. If he finds us first, you'll need more than prayers, he said, his voice low, serious, his eyes on hers for a moment before he stepped back. They practiced as the shadows grew long, stretching across the cove, her movements slow and unsteady, her arm aching from the effort, her shoulders stiff. He stayed patient, moving like water, smooth, effortless, every motion precise, showing her how to shift her weight, how to strike. She hated how easy he made it look, how clumsy she felt beside him, her hands shaking, but she kept going, determined, sweat beading on her forehead. Afterward she slumped against the rock wall, sweaty and sore, her breath coming in short gasps, her chest heaving. Teach me to shoot next, she asked, half serious, wiping her brow with her sleeve. You'd scare the birds, he said, dry as dust, leaning against the opposite wall. I scare worse things, she muttered, and he almost smiled, almost just a twitch at the corner of his mouth gone as quick as it came. That night, under a sky thick with stars bright and cold, he left a trail of false prints down the canyon path, scuffing the dirt with his boots, snapping twigs, kicking rocks to his sleeve. Anyone following his movements silent and deliberate. She watched from the shadows of the cove, marveling at how he moved, blending into the land like he was part of it, a ghost in the dark, leaving no trace of himself. He came back after midnight, his steps silent on the sand, and tossed her a small pouch, the leather soft and worn. Tobacco, he said. Smoke, it covers our scent. She never smoked, didn't like the idea, the smell sharp in her nose, but she lit it anyway, coughing as the bitter taste filled her mouth, the smoke curling around her in thin wisps drifting up to the arches. Thank you, she said again, her voice softer now, meaning it. He glanced toward the ridge, his face tight, his jaw set. He'll come soon, he said, his words a warning, a promise. Then we make ready. You really want to fight him? She asked, the weight of it settling on her heavy and real. I don't want to, she said, honest, her voice steady despite the fear flickering inside. I need to, he nodded, slow and sure, his eyes meeting hers, and they sat in silence, two strangers bound by pain and purpose, the fire dwindling between them to glowing coals, casting faint light across their faces. Lila picked up the obsidian shard she'd used to cut herself free, turning it over in her hand, feeling its edges still sharp, still warm from her pocket, a piece of her survival. This saved me, she said, holding it up, the fire light glinting off its surface. He looked at it, his eyes dark deep. It cuts both ways, he said, a warning in his tone, soft but firm. I'll remember that, she replied, tucking it back in her coat, her fingers lingering on it. She leaned back against the rock, closing her eyes, the smoke curling around her, the herbs from earlier still dulling her pain, softening the edges of her exhaustion. For the first time in days, she rested, not because she had to, not because her body gave out, but because with him near she felt something dangerously close to safe, a flicker of trust she hadn't expected, growing quiet and steady in her chest. Morning came with bird song sharp and clear, cutting through the stillness, and golden light spilling over the cliffs, washing the cove in warmth, chasing away the night's chill. Talon Gray was gone when she woke, the bed roll empty beside her, and panic flared hot in her chest, her heart leaping, until he appeared again, stepping into the cove with a rabbit strong bites, legs dangling from his hand, blood dripping faintly onto the sand. He skinned and cooked it without fuss, his knife flashing quick and sure, the blade a blur, and they ate quickly, the meat tough but filling, grease coating her fingers, warm in her stomach. LLA limped easier now, her legs still but stronger, the swelling down more than yesterday, the pain a dull ache instead of sharp stab. Can I ask you something, she said between bites, wiping her hands on her torn dress, the fabric stiff with dirt. He nodded, chewing silently, his eyes on the fire. Why'd you help me, she asked, her voice quiet but steady, needing to know, to understand. He didn't answer right away, wiping his hands on his pants before tossing a bone in a fire, watching it crackle and pop. Because the last time I heard a scream like that I didn't move fast enough, he said finally, his words heavy, carrying old pain, a wound that hadn't healed. She studied his face, the weight behind his eyes sinking in deep, settling in her chest. You still hear it, she asked, softer now, her voice gentle. Every time I close my eyes, he said, his voice low, almost lost in the fire's hiss, his gaze distant. She reached across the space between them, touching his hand briefly, her fingers brushing his knuckles rough and callous. You got there in time this time, she said, her voice firm, wanting him to believe it. He looked at her, then down at their hands, and nodded slow, like he was convincing himself, testing the truth of it. I know, he said, quiet but sure, a small crack in his armor. They didn't speak of it again, letting the moment settle heavy and real. Later that day, as shadows stretched long across the canyon floor and the wind picked up, rattling the rocks, Talon Gray pointed to the trail below, crouching low, his hand brushing the dirt tracks. He said, his voice tight, 3 horses fresh heading this way. Her chest tightened, her breath catching, Faye and resolve mixing together. Then it's begun, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her, her hands clenching. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, standing tall, his shadow long against the rock. We don't run, he said, his eyes meeting hers, fierce and certain, a fire in them she hadn't seen before. She nodded, her heart pounding but resolute, ready. No, we make them hunt something they can't catch. His lips twitched, not quite a smile but close, a spark of something shared, a pact sealed. The wind rose higher, carrying the scent of dust and danger, swirling around them like a storm, building a warning of what was coming. The hunted were turning into hunters, and Lilac Carver was ready, ready for Silas Kane, ready for the fight, ready for whatever came next, her blood singing with it.